We are all well aware of the suffering and evil in the world. Horrific suffering. Unspeakable evil.
Is it sin? Free will? Contingency? Probably sin, right? Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. If you're new to the channel, why not tap on the subscribe button so you can be notified when we post new science, theology, or news videos. Today we're going to continue our look at William Lane Craig's animated series on the arguments for God with his first episode on suffering and evil. And when we say we, I mean that I'm being joined by fellow former Christian Prophet of Zod.
Well, hey, look where I am. Awesome. I've been a fan of this channel since back when I had just a couple hundred subscribers. So it's an honor and a great thrill to be here.
See how long that lasts.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Or Mr. Ogia, or whatever you want me to call you.
Whatever you want, man. Just call me when you're done.
Wait, you just said we'd be doing this together.
Listening to William Lane Craig arguments is part of my definition of suffering and evil. Use it. You got this.
Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil but not willing, he is not good. But if he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent?
All right, there's one thing we need to nip in the bud right here and now. Craig, or whoever's narrating this well-worn nonsense for him, claims that atheists expect theists to reconcile an all-powerful, all-loving God with the fact that suffering exists. This isn't necessarily true, and this choice of words represents our objection very poorly. Suffering is an abstract term that imprecisely describes a single component, a single flavor of a lot of our experiences, and the suffering itself cannot be singularly extracted from these experiences. Modest amounts of it can be interwoven with and even bleed into other sometimes positive emotions, which actually makes it an important and powerful part of our lives. To remove everything that includes some suffering is not realistic, logical, or even necessarily desirable. So when the apologist uses an overly broad term like suffering in this context, when the conversation should be about unnecessary horrors and gratuitous violence for which there's no plausible justification, he's leaving the door open to distractions, giving himself room to explain why God allows us to stub our toes, while hoping his audience forgets the fact that he just plopped down with a bucket of popcorn and watched the Holocaust. On top of it all, this phrasing insinuates, and was possibly meant to insinuate, that we have childish expectations of God.
No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements, so there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that would bring out the alleged contradiction.
My previous videos in this series have identified a number of places where Craig phrases a premise in such a way that it smuggles in assumptions. We call it begging the question. If anyone can identify this, it should be him.
Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants.
So far so good, I guess. At least any world without logical contradictions.
And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering.
Again, phrasing is important here. I can't stress that enough. Based on where this is going, I suspect he wants to mire us down in the semantics of what it would mean for God to prefer or create a world without suffering. But what if we allowed that it was okay for God to have created the world more or less like it is, but insist he should, I don't know, show up at the house of parents who are persistently beating, molesting, and otherwise tormenting their children? He doesn't have to create a perfect world to live up to the minimal expectations we have of child protective services.
So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true?
So are the atheist's two hidden assumptions true? That's a pretty loaded question until we establish that atheists generally make these assumptions. Now, I do think the first one's pretty obviously true of an omnipotent creator God, unless he's going to try to muddy things with a poorly conceived objection about free will, which, come on, we all know is going to happen. But I've already shown how the choice of the word suffering pushes the second objection into territory I wouldn't argue from and doubt most other atheists would. Come on, man. Don't force me to use something as trite as the word straw man here.
Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense.
Ooh, now before we allow this square circle buffoonery to pass, we should back up and clarify which task we're actually talking about. And I think the best way to do that is with an analogy. Let's say a police officer sees a knife-wielding attacker coming at a woman in a dark alley. The attacker is not exceptionally strong or fast, and any competent law enforcement professional should easily be able to intervene. But instead, our officer just stands there and watches the victim get stabbed over and over until she bleeds out and dies. Would we find this acceptable? No. And if we wanted to get all fancy and Epicurean about it, we might phrase our criticism like this. If the officer was willing to stop the stabbing but not able, then he is not competent. If he was able to stop the stabbing but not willing, then he is a bad officer. If he was both willing and able, then how could the stabbing have taken place? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him a police officer? I don't know. I guess that's where the phrasing works better for God. But the point is, we'd all agree that the officer sucked at his job and was a piece of shit person on top of it. But let's add a justification into the mix. As he's watching the gruesome scene unfold, he shrugs and says, "Boy, what a shame. But I can't force him to freely do good, at least without violating his free will. So what are you going to do?" Does this get him off the hook? Of course not. Nobody ever considered him obligated to force the criminal to freely do good. To clear the low bar of not being a piece of shit person, all this officer had to do was protect someone from harm. And if he tried to excuse himself from this achievable and necessary task by talking about the impossibility of the totally different task of forcing the criminal to want to be a good person, we'd all recognize his transparent attempt at changing the subject. The fact is, he could have stopped the attack without violating free will. Whether he had to use lethal force or could have instead tackled and subdued the attacker, no physical action he took would have altered the attacker's desires or anything else about his mindset. The whole time he was being restrained and cuffed, the guy could have lain there squirming and foaming at the mouth and just wishing to death he could go stab someone. Because free will is not compromised when someone is stopped from doing something. So if the police or government or parents can restrain people for the sake of safety without violating free will, why can't God? Further, if they're all morally obligated to do so as far as they're able when it protects people from harm, then why isn't God? The Epicurean problem does not demand that God make people do good. In fact, it doesn't demand that he alter their thinking or personalities at all. It just calls for him to do something to curtail the impact of their bad actions on other people. So fine. Forcing free will agents to do good is as logically impossible as creating a square circle. But you know what isn't as hard as creating a square circle? Choosing to get out of your chair and do something instead of passively sitting there watching every single brutal act of murder, rape, torture, and child abuse that's ever happened in the history of humankind. In other words, you can be better than a piece of shit without breaking any rules of logic. That's all this logical problem is really demanding of God. And bringing free will into it is deliberate misdirection.
So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true.
And we never needed it to be true.
Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true.
Okay, this blanket appeal to God's infinite qualities is one of those things that really bugs me. If you're a Christian, sure. You might accept that literally any horrible thing can be justified as part of God's infinite plan, and you might do so without expecting his reasons to be demonstrated to your satisfaction. But that's just because you're already parked in your belief system and accustomed to accepting it at face value. You start off thinking he exists, he's God, and he's infinite. So to you, a bald-faced declaration that everything might be part of a greater plan makes sense because you feel like it came from God. But to everybody else, this excuse is worthless because it just came from another person. To illustrate, let's switch roles for a moment. If I brought you a rock and said it was God, you'd expect me to give you a really compelling reason to believe it, right? In fact, I dare say you'd ask me why it just sits there being a rock, because nothing about sitting there being a rock seems very godlike. So what would move you from thinking it was just a rock to thinking it was God? You'd probably need some solid demonstration or extremely spectacular explanation of why this was the case. But what if I just told you, well, the rock is infinitely intelligent, so if it seems silly to us that it would just sit there being a rock, that's just because its greater plan is beyond our finite understanding. It might not make sense to us at the time, but how can we presume to understand an infinite God rock's reasons for sitting there being a rock? So you see what I just did? I showed you something with apparently mundane qualities, a rock, and made an assertion, which is that it was God. Then, instead of demonstrating anything godlike about it, I just made a second assertion, which was that it had an incomprehensible purpose for looking mundane. Now think about how badly this fails and why. You as a human can't just assert something's God, then think you've gotten any traction with a non-believer by asserting something about that claimed God's properties. Sure, it might tie up internal inconsistencies for people who already believe, but that's it. So please understand that when you point to something as mundane as a universe full of random and sometimes awful events and assert that God's in charge of it, you need to show us why in terms that are accessible and make sense to us. You can't just make a second assertion that he has reasons beyond our comprehension. Since no God is speaking up, we are just stuck with humans weaving webs of excuses for something that looks natural. And that's sure not going to push me toward believing in God.
For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear.
Wow. There's just something so audacious about concocting a series of assertions and then strutting in and telling other people they have the burden of proof to untangle and thoroughly disprove them. I doubt anybody could conclusively disprove that my infinite rock God had reasons for sitting there being a rock. But why should they have to? I'm just making untestable and wildly superfluous explanations for why a rock looks like a rock. And if I did this and demanded they prove me wrong, they'd all know I was just being an ass. Geez, why am I even talking about this?
It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
Oh, great. We're at the part where they dismiss all iterations of a counter-apologetic by quote-mining specific atheists or agnostics who are probably just speaking to the specific limitations of specific versions of it. This is such a Craig thing to do.
It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
Yay! 3 isolated decades old? Wait. Hey, could you please animate me clapping?
We don't have Disney money. There's no clapping in the Paulogia verse. Calm down.
Yay.
But this is hardly the end of the discussion. We still need to explore the probability version of the problem of evil.
Not today, we don't. There's always plenty more, William Lane Craig. My thanks to Prophet of Zod for alleviating today's suffering. If you aren't already subscribed, he has one of the best, most thought out, most pointed channels in all of YouTube, and you seriously owe it to yourself to check it out now. If only for the times where I've played the characters of Adam and Ken Ham. Tap to watch.